Do it. No witnesses. Eliminate them all. Now.
Clean it before Friday, and make sure she's not there when it happens. That was all Darnell Rook said. 6 words into a phone pressed tight against his jaw, spoken the way a man speaks when he has said the same kind of thing so many times that the weight of it no longer registers. No hesitation, no lowering of the voice, just 6 words in a silence that followed them like a held breath. The house was still. 3:47 a.m., and Cassian Rhee's car sat in the driveway with the engine ticking as it cooled. That particular rhythm of metal contracting after heat, a sound that said he had been somewhere else for a long time and had only just decided to come home. If this story already has you hooked, hit like and subscribe, because what Imani Voss left inside that house is going to change everything you think you know about who holds the real power. The front door opened quietly. Cassian had always moved that way, careful, measured, the kind of quiet that a certain kind of man cultivates over years of needing to enter rooms without announcing himself. He was 44, lean in the way that expensive suits hide well, and his face in the low light of the foyer carried the specific blankness of someone who had decided, somewhere on the drive home, that whatever guilt he might have felt was no longer worth the effort. He set his keys on the tray by the door. That was habit. 11 years of habit. The tray was empty. He looked at it for a moment, just a moment, the way a person looks at something familiar when something about it is wrong, but the wrongness hasn't yet assembled itself into a coherent alarm. The tray was there. The tray was always there. But the small collection of objects that usually occupied it, her reading glasses, her transit card, the brass key ring she'd carried since before they married, all of it was gone. He moved down the hallway. The second thing he noticed was the absence of sound. Not the ordinary silence of a sleeping house, but a different quality, a silence that felt less like quiet and more like empty. He had lived in enough places to know the difference. Occupied spaces have a texture, even when everyone in them is asleep. This house, at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday in March, had no texture at all. The bedroom door was closed. He reached for the handle and found it locked. Not the privacy lock, the kind you push in thoughtlessly before bed, but the deadbolt, the one that required a key from the outside. The one neither of them had used in years because there had never been a reason. He stood there with his hand on a door that would not open, in a house that felt like it had already moved on without him. And somewhere in the kitchen, or maybe it was the study, the sound hard to place in the stillness, something clicked. A soft, mechanical sound. A lock disengaging somewhere that wasn't the bedroom door. Then silence again. The kind of silence that follows a message delivered. To understand what Imani Voss left behind that night, you have to understand what she had spent 11 years building, and how expertly she had made certain that no one in that house, not Cassian, not Darnell Rook, not Floyd Yesh, and not Britta Calloway, had ever seen it clearly. She had arrived in Cassian's life the way certain people arrive in the lives of powerful men, quietly and at a moment when his attention was elsewhere. He had been in the middle of expanding his restaurant holdings into South Carolina at the time, and she had been introduced through a mutual acquaintance at an industry event in Buckhead. She was 32 then. She had a calm about her that he described to a colleague afterward as restful, which was, she later reflected, probably the most useful thing anyone had ever said about her without knowing it. She dressed without statement, fitted slacks, clean lines, a preference for dark colors that read as simple and cost nothing in attention. Her apartment at the time had been orderly to a degree that people sometimes mistook for sparseness, a quality they attributed to minimalism rather than to the more accurate explanation, which was that she had been trained from a young age to maintain environments that could be cleared in under 4 minutes if necessary. This was not a detail she shared. What she shared with Cassian, in the months that followed that first meeting, was a version of herself that was entirely true in its particulars and entirely incomplete in its architecture. She told him she'd grown up in Baltimore. That was true. She told him her mother had been a school teacher. That was also true. She told him she'd spent her 20s working in financial compliance, a phrase that was accurate enough in its broad outline to survive scrutiny while telling him almost nothing meaningful about the specifics. He didn't press. Men like Cassian rarely did, when the woman in question seemed content in the space he offered her. Contentment, in his world, was a kind of invisibility, and invisibility for Imani had always been the point. They married in a small ceremony 14 months after they met. Cassian's associates attended. Several of them looked at Imani the way people look at furniture, acknowledging its presence in the room without granting it any particular significance. Darnell Rook, who had been Cassian's head of personal security for 6 years by then, shook her hand once at the reception and did not speak to her again for the remainder of the evening. He had a way of categorizing people on contact, filing them into slots: asset, liability, irrelevant. And Imani read, without difficulty, exactly which slot she'd been assigned. She smiled at him pleasantly and made a note of the timestamp in the small leather notebook she kept in her clutch. That notebook. If anyone had ever looked closely at it, truly closely, past the first few pages of grocery lists and appointment reminders that served as its unremarkable cover, they would have found something considerably more structured. Not a journal, not a diary, a log. Dates and times in the left margin, written in a hand so small it required effort to read. Observations in the right column, clipped and precise, using language that moved between ordinary domestic notation and something considerably more deliberate. The kind of notation that reconstructed, from the outside, exactly like the record of a cautious woman keeping track of her life. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Cassian never looked at the notebook. He was not by nature a curious man about the people around him. He was curious about structures, financial structures, hierarchical ones, the architecture of influence and leverage. People for him tended to be pieces within those structures, rather than objects of inquiry in themselves. His wife fell into a category he found comfortable, present, competent in the management of their shared domestic life, unlikely to cause problems. He told a business associate once, over a dinner Imani served and then quietly withdrew from, that he'd married a woman who understood the value of discretion. He meant it as a compliment. He was not wrong. He just did not understand what he was complimenting. The first time Floyd Yesh noticed something was a Tuesday in October, 2 years into the marriage. Floyd was Cassian's financial architect, a title that appeared nowhere on any business document, but described his function with reasonable accuracy. He managed the accounting systems for Cassian's restaurant group, which comprised 11 establishments across Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina, and which processed, in aggregate, considerably more revenue than 11 restaurants of their size and traffic could be expected to generate. Floyd was meticulous, bespectacled, and possessed of the particular professional pride of a man who considered his specialized knowledge his primary form of social status. He visited the house occasionally for working sessions with Cassian, and on those visits, Imani was generally present in the background, retrieving things, offering coffee, existing in the domestic periphery that Floyd's brain automatically filtered out. On that Tuesday in October, he arrived early. Cassian was still on a call in the study, and Imani met Floyd at the door and led him to the dining room table, where the relevant binders were already arranged in the order Floyd would need them. He sat down. He opened the first binder. He paused. The tabs, the quarterly divisions, the cross-reference notations in the margins of the summary sheets, small pencil markings barely visible that Imani had made while organizing the documents for Cassian the previous afternoon. Floyd looked at those markings for a long moment. They weren't random organizational marks. They were referencing specific line items between sections in a way that would only be meaningful to someone who understood the underlying financial relationships between the documents. relationships that were not described anywhere in the binders themselves. He looked up. Imani was setting a cup of coffee at his elbow, her expression pleasant and entirely without emphasis. "Thank you," he said. "Of course," she said, and withdrew. Floyd sat with the binders and his coffee and said nothing to Cassian about the marks when Cassian emerged from the study 20 minutes later. He filed the observation the way careful men file things they don't yet understand, in a place he could return to. That evening, he ran a search on Imani's name through the databases he had access to. What came back was clean, unremarkably, completely clean. A social security number, a credit history, a Baltimore address from her 20s, tax records showing a decade of earnings in financial compliance roles. Nothing flagged, nothing unusual. He was not reassured. He had enough experience with carefully constructed profiles to know that the absence of red flags was not the same as the absence of something to find. It simply meant that whoever had built the profile was good at their work. He made a note and moved on, because he had no evidence, and more importantly, because raising concerns about Cassian's wife to Cassian without evidence was the kind of move that ended professional relationships. What Floyd did not know, could not have known, was that Imani had noted the direction of his gaze from the kitchen doorway. She had registered the pause over the binders, the slight recalibration in his expression when he looked up. She had registered that he had looked, and why, and what it meant that a man in Floyd's position was now curious about her. That evening, she made a note in her own records. Not in the small notebook, that one was for observations. This note went into the encrypted partition on a secondary device she maintained separately from anything in the house network, in a file whose naming convention would have been recognizable to precisely the kind of people Floyd's background check would never have found her connected to. She adjusted her behavior with the documents by a single degree, not enough to erase the signal she'd inadvertently sent, but enough to make it ambiguous going forward. A woman who sometimes organized things with precision, a woman with a good eye for paperwork, nothing more than that. The adjustment was so minor that Floyd, watching for it, found nothing conclusive over the following months, and eventually downgraded his suspicion from active concern to background noise. This too was a skill, knowing exactly how much to give people so that they felt they had an answer when they had only received a permission to stop asking. The microaggressions, if Imani had ever chosen to call them that, had begun before the marriage and never fully stopped. Darnell Rook was the most direct about it, in the way that men who rely on physical authority often are. He spoke to her in a register slightly below what he used with everyone else. Not rude enough to create an incident, but consistently pitched at a frequency that said, "I have categorized you, and you are not significant." When Cassian's associates came to the house for dinners, Darnell would position himself at the room's center and engage with the men around him, while his body language created an invisible perimeter that naturally excluded Imani from the conversational flow. When she moved through that perimeter to clear plates or refresh drinks, he didn't step aside. She had learned to navigate around him without contact, a choreography she never acknowledged, and he seemed unaware he was imposing. He once, 14 months into the marriage, told Cassian in her presence, in a tone that suggested he'd either forgotten she was there or genuinely didn't consider her worth the courtesy of discretion, that he thought Cassian should keep things cleaner at the house during certain meetings. Cassian had nodded without looking up from his phone. Imani had continued folding napkins at the kitchen counter, her hands moving at their usual unhurried pace, and had written the time and the exact phrasing in her notebook that evening. Britta Calloway was subtler, which made her, in some ways, more instructive. Britta had been the organization's legal architect for 4 years before Imani arrived. The woman who structured the contracts, the holding companies, the layered entity arrangements that gave Cassian's operation its paper legitimacy. She was precise, controlled, and possessed of the particular confidence of someone who understood that her expertise made her indispensable. She was also, Imani recognized within 3 meetings, aware of her own attractiveness in relation to Cassian, and had arranged her professional proximity to him accordingly. Britta never spoke to Imani unkindly. She was too careful for that. Instead, she developed a habit of speaking across Imani, directing conversation to Cassian or to other people in the room while Imani was physically present, in a manner so consistent and so practiced that it would have required effort to characterize it as deliberate. She remembered Imani's name on approximately 2/3 of occasions. On the others, she produced a slight pause that she covered smoothly with, "Sorry, remind me?" A question she never needed to ask anyone else in the room. At a dinner in January of the 3rd year, Britta had discussed a contract restructuring for one of the Tennessee properties, while Imani sat 3 seats away. The discussion was not particularly sensitive, but it was specific enough that Cassian's instinct was usually to conduct such conversations away from domestic settings. Britta had apparently revised that assessment. She did not look at Imani once during the 20-minute conversation. The implicit logic was visible. There was no need to look at something you'd already determined posed no risk. Imani ate her meal and listened to every word and noted 4 specific details about the Tennessee restructuring that did not align with what she already knew about the account. This was the thing about being treated as invisible. It was occasionally a problem. More often, it was an operational advantage that Imani had learned, a long time ago, to use with deliberate care. The email appeared on a laptop on a Wednesday night in February, 9 months before Cassian came home at 3:47 a.m. to find a locked door and a missing keyring. Cassian had been traveling, a 2-day trip to Nashville that had extended unexpectedly. The laptop was his secondary machine, the one he used at home and left open more carelessly than his primary. He'd asked Imani to retrieve a PDF from it before he left, a catering contract he needed for a call, and had given her the password without a second thought. The laptop was sitting open on the desk in the study when she found the email. She had not been looking for it. This was important, not for the purposes of any future legal proceeding, but because it was true, and because Imani was precise about the difference between what she'd been doing and what she'd found. She had been navigating to the Documents folder. The email client was open behind it. She had moved to close the browser and instead read the subject line. Rhee, Q3 clearance, L7 account status, from B. Calloway to F. Yesh, CC, redacted. The message was 3 sentences long. It referenced a clearance threshold, a quarterly deadline, and a phrase, "Coordinate with R before the transfer clears," that placed Darnell Rook in direct operational proximity to a financial movement that, based on what Imani already knew about the L7 accounts, was not a routine business transaction. She read it twice. She did not touch the keyboard. She took out her phone, opened the camera, and photographed the screen. Date stamp visible in the system clock. Document path visible in the open file. Email client open in the background. 3 photographs from slightly different angles. She put her phone away, closed the browser window. Not the email, just the active tab, leaving the application in the state she'd found it, and navigated to the catering contract PDF she'd come for. She printed the PDF. She left the study. She texted Cassian the contract within 4 minutes of finding the email. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and wrote nothing. Instead, she opened the small secondary device, the one that lived in a fireproof case inside a hollowed space behind the baseboard of the closet in the guest room, and added the photographs to the encrypted partition under a file timestamp that was already 11 years old. Then she closed the device. She put it back. She made tea. The following day, she stopped at a hardware store on her way back from the grocery. She purchased a battery-operated audio recorder, standard retail, no specialized equipment, and a set of replacement batteries. She paid cash. That evening, after Cassian had moved to the study for his evening calls, she placed the recorder in the living room bookshelf. in a position that captured the common areas of the main floor, and activated it. Georgia Code Section 16-11-62 prohibits the recording of a private conversation without the consent of at least one party to that conversation. As a resident of the home and a participant in any conversation that occurred within it, Imani was that party. She had checked this statute 6 months earlier. She had written the citation in a separate section of her notebook, in a different pen, as a standalone reference. She was not a person who moved before she understood the rules. And she was not a person who moved until the time was precisely right. The week after the email, Imani did something she had not done in 11 years of marriage. She asked Cassian, in a tone of ordinary domestic practicality, whether she could review the property insurance documents for the South Carolina acquisition. She explained that she had noticed a discrepancy in the renewal cycle on one of the existing policies and wanted to make sure the new property was set up correctly. Cassian handed her the folder without looking up. The folder contained the property insurance documents, as expected. It also contained, filed 3 pages behind them, a financial summary that referenced the L7 account by name, not a code, the actual notation, in a document marked for internal distribution. The summary showed a transfer figure for the third quarter that was, by Imani's calculation, $730,000 above the amount that had been reported in the documents Floyd had brought to the house the previous month. She reviewed the folder, replaced the documents in the order she'd found them, and returned the folder to Cassian's desk, with a note that the insurance renewal cycles were correctly aligned and he didn't need to take any action. "Thanks," he said to his laptop screen. That gap, $730,000 across a single quarter, went into the encrypted partition that evening, tagged with the source document date, the document title, and the page reference. It was not the largest discrepancy she had recorded over 11 years. It was not the most significant, but it was the most recent, and it connected the L7 account directly to a document that bore Cassian's name in the distribution line, which was a linkage she had not been able to establish in writing before. She noted it in the log as confirmed principal-level document contact with L7 designation. She noted the date. She noted that this was the 8th piece of evidence in the category she had labeled direct financial nexus. She closed the device. She went to bed before Cassian that evening, which was unusual, and he either didn't notice or didn't remark on it, which was not unusual at all. 2 weeks after the email, Cassian came home from Nashville and mentioned, over dinner, that he'd been thinking about bringing Britta in more directly on some of the property management decisions. He phrased it as a business efficiency question. He did not look at Imani when he said it. "That makes sense," Imani said. He looked up, perhaps expecting something more. She met his eyes with an expression of mild, pleasant agreement and offered him more rice. He seemed satisfied. He moved on to a story about a supplier issue in Chattanooga. 3 days later, Britta came to the house for a working meeting. This was not new. Britta had come to the house for working meetings on several occasions, but this one ran longer than scheduled, and at one point, while Cassian stepped out to take a call in the study, Britta remained at the dining table with her documents spread around her and looked up at Imani with the expression of a woman making a calculation. "Cassian says you're very organized," Britta said. Her tone was pleasant. The subtext was a question in a suit. "I like things to have a place," Imani said. Britta looked back at her documents. "That must be useful." It was the closest thing to a direct engagement Britta had offered in years, and it had the precise quality of a probe, a hand extended into an unfamiliar space to see if anything reached back. Imani recognized the technique because she had used it herself, in other contexts, in other rooms, long before she had ever heard of Cassian Rhee. She gave Britta nothing. Not rudeness, not warmth, not the small social resistance that might have registered as interesting. Just the smooth, slightly opaque pleasantness she had long ago perfected. The expression that said, "There is nothing here worth looking at." Britta returned to her documents. Cassian came back from the study. The meeting continued. Imani cleared the coffee cups and went to fold laundry. And behind the neutral surface of the afternoon, something had shifted a degree in both directions. Britta slightly more assured that Imani posed no threat, and Imani slightly more certain about the timing of what was coming. Floyd Yesh came to the house 3 weeks after the Britta meeting, on a Thursday morning, with a set of documents he said Cassian had asked him to drop off. Cassian was not home. Imani accepted the envelope at the door and said she'd pass it along. Floyd did not immediately leave. He stood on the front step with his briefcase at his side and his head tilted at what Imani read as a prepared angle. Casual, unhurried, but positioned to observe her response to whatever he was about to say. "I've been reviewing some of the restaurant group accounts," he said, "going back a few years. There are some documentation gaps that are going to need addressing before the next quarterly review. I wanted to make sure Cassian was aware." "I'll let him know," Imani said. "Some of the gaps are in files that were stored on the home network," Floyd continued. "Files that would have been accessible to anyone with a house login." He watched her face when he said this. She recognized the watch for what it was, a technical challenge, not a conversation. He was phrasing an accusation as a neutral statement and studying her reaction for confirmation. She nodded, thoughtfully and without hurry. "I wouldn't know about the specifics. I use the home network for ordinary things. If there are documentation questions, Cassian would be the one to address them." She paused, just briefly. "Though if it helps, the system logs should show access timestamps. That might be cleaner than going by memory." Floyd blinked. The response was so procedurally reasonable, the kind of response you'd expect from someone with nothing to hide, someone who understood how audit trails worked, that it occupied exactly the space where his suspicion lived without confirming it. He had been reaching for a reaction, and she'd handed him a suggestion that made him look at his own investigative method instead of at her. "Of course," he said after a moment, "I'll do that. Let me know if there's anything I can pull together for Cassian on this end," she said, and stepped back from the door with a small, closing gesture. She closed the door, set the envelope on the entry table, and stood in the hallway for 4 seconds with her hands at her sides. Then she went to the guest room closet. She wrote a single sentence in the log. "Floyd Yesh, direct inquiry, framed as documentation review, watching for response. Approach, procedural, deflect. Access timestamp suggestion noted." She closed the log. She picked up the envelope and placed it on Cassian's desk. That evening, after dinner, she mentioned to Cassian that Floyd had stopped by with documents and mentioned some documentation questions about the home network access logs. Cassian waved a hand and said, "Floyd worried too much. He told her to ignore it." She said she would. There was a moment in the space after Cassian's dismissal where Imani sat with the particular stillness she had learned to cultivate in situations where she needed to think clearly without the thinking being visible. Floyd was not wrong to look. He was simply looking in the wrong place, with instruments calibrated for a different kind of problem. He was searching for a person who had made a careless mistake. What he had found instead was a person who had spent 11 years making no mistakes at all, and who had, in consequence, left him nothing to examine except the pristine surface of someone else's cover story. The problem with Floyd's approach was the problem with most institutional investigations. It began from the assumption that the subject had been caught. It organized its logic around the evidence it expected to find, and when the evidence wasn't there, it revised the probability of guilt downward rather than upward. This was the correct procedure technically. It was also precisely the cognitive structure that Imani had been designing around for the better part of a decade. She was not sloppy. She was not lucky. She was operating at a level of precision that Floyd's instruments simply were not built to detect. 2 days later, Floyd filed a request to review the home network access logs with the IT vendor they used. He received the logs within a week. What he found was a record of entirely ordinary domestic internet usage, streaming services, online grocery accounts, a consistent pattern of access that matched the profile of someone who used the internet the way millions of people used it. Nothing flagged, nothing anomalous. Which was correct, because the device Imani used for anything that mattered had never touched the home network. It operated on a separate connection routed through an encrypted relay, and had done so since the first month of the marriage. Floyd stared at the logs and came to the conclusion he had nowhere useful to go with his suspicion. He filed his concern away again, deeper this time, and went back to his quarterly review. Imani noted his retreat in the log and revised her timeline forward by 3 weeks. The second time Floyd came at her was less procedural and more direct, and it happened not at the front door, but in the garage, 3 days before the dinner party, on a Wednesday morning when she was loading grocery bags into the car. He was simply there, parked on the street, walking up the driveway with a thin folder under his arm, in the manner of a man making a professional visit that was only incidentally unannounced. He greeted her with a nod. He did not move to help with the bags, which was fine, but he also did not step back to give her room to work, which was not accidental. "I've been looking at the structure of the L-series accounts," he said. He said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed, precisely, without the small hesitations of genuine spontaneity. She kept loading bags. "Cassian's home after 2. "I know," Floyd said. "I wanted to speak with you first." She stopped. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was entirely neutral and entirely complete. No curiosity, no alarm, just a woman standing in her own garage, looking at a man who had come uninvited to tell her something she could already hear was coming. "The account designations in a certain filing don't match the operating ledger," he said. "There are 2 possible explanations for that. The first is that someone made a clerical error." He looked at her. "The second is considerably more significant." "You should bring that to Cassian," she said. "I'd like to understand the discrepancy before I bring it anywhere," he said. "It would help to know how the filing was originally organized." He was asking her, without asking her, whether she had accessed the accounts she had photographed. He was asking her to place herself inside the document trail without having to make the accusation explicit. Because explicit accusations require evidence, and he still didn't have any. He was fishing with the lure of a false premise, that she might explain the discrepancy, and that in explaining it, she would necessarily reveal what she knew about it. She looked at the groceries. She looked at Floyd. "I file household expense reports," she said. "Cassian manages the business accounts. If there's a discrepancy in a business filing, I wouldn't be the person who could tell you how it got there." She picked up the last bag. "I'll let Cassian know you came by." Floyd stood with a thin folder and the look of a man revising his model. She could see it, the recalculation happening in real time, the adjustment of his assessment of the risk she posed. He was moving her in his private taxonomy from probably irrelevant towards something that still lacked a definitive label but was no longer comfortable in its previous position. She moved past him toward the house door. She did not check whether he watched her go. She already knew that he did. Inside, she noted the encounter. She noted the specific phrase, the account designations in a certain filing, because it was the first time Floyd had used the word designation in connection with the accounts in her presence, which meant he had now connected the L7 notation to the broader account structure without Cassian's direction. He had arrived at that connection on his own, which meant he was more capable than she had initially assessed, and she needed to account for that. She updated her timeline again, not forward this time. She moved one specific element earlier. The dinner party in March was Britta's idea, or rather, it was framed as Britta's idea. A gathering of the people most central to Cassian's operation, presented as a celebration of a successful South Carolina property acquisition. Cassian agreed to it. He told Imani with the ease of a man who assumed agreement, and Imani agreed with the ease of a woman who had already anticipated it. 12 people arrived that Saturday evening. Cassian's 4 core associates, including Floyd and Darnell, Britta, who arrived slightly later than the others and wore a dress that established, without ambiguity, what kind of evening she intended it to be. 2 attorneys from the firm that handled Cassian's legitimate business interests, a commercial real estate broker and his wife, and a city councilman whose name Imani noted with particular attention because his name appeared in a certain set of documents she had cataloged under a subsection of the L7 file. Imani had arranged the seating. She placed herself at the table's secondary position, not the far end, which would have been conspicuous, but offset from the main conversational cluster in a way that was natural and unnoticeable, and gave her a clear sightline to every other person at the table. She placed the councilman adjacent to Floyd because their proximity would tell her something about the nature of their relationship that she did not yet have confirmed. She placed Darnell across from the broker because Darnell near a conversation involving money and real estate typically produced a specific kind of posture, a slight forward lean, a jaw set at a particular angle, that she documented twice before in meetings she'd observed from the kitchen doorway. Britta sat at the position nearest Cassian and spent the first 40 minutes of dinner addressing the table at large in a way that consistently reoriented the room's attention toward herself and toward Cassian's response to her. She was good at it, practiced in the skill of holding conversational space. She made a comment about the South Carolina acquisition that drew laughter from the right people. She referenced a detail from a contract discussion that was specific enough to signal her importance without being indiscreet enough to create a problem. She did not address Imani once during those 40 minutes. This was not unusual. What was slightly different from other evenings was the quality of the omission, more deliberate, more performed, as though the crowd had somehow expanded the audience for the dynamic Britta had been establishing for years. Imani served, cleared, refilled glasses, and listened. The councilman, she had confirmed by the 3rd course that his name was on a campaign finance disclosure that connected to a shell entity upstream of the L7 accounts, had a conversational habit of leaning toward Floyd at moments of emphasis. Not constantly, just at specific moments when a topic touched something adjacent to what they apparently shared. It was a small behavioral tell. Imani noted it, confirmed it twice more over the course of the evening, and folded it into what she already knew. After the main course, she moved to the kitchen to prepare the dessert plates. Darnell followed her. This was not accidental. She registered it from the moment he stood up from the table, the direction of his movement, the unhurried pace that was designed to read as incidental. She had her back to the kitchen entry when he entered, and she kept it there for 3 seconds before turning, which gave her enough time to adjust her grip on the serving spoon to a position that was entirely ordinary and entirely unrestricted. "Cassian keeping you busy?" he said. His tone had that specific texture, the conversational pitch slightly below normal, the rhetorical question that wasn't actually asking anything, the kind of delivery that was designed to land as a small, deniable diminishment. "Always something to do," she said. He moved to the counter and leaned against it with the body language of a man making himself at home in a room that he decided belonged to him. He was a large man, not unusually tall, but broad in the way that says, "I have never needed to make room for anyone." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her for 11 years, categorizing, filing, not a threat, not a person, something to be managed. "You heard about the Thursday thing," he said. It wasn't quite a question. It had the phrasing of a thing said to someone you want to see respond without being able to claim you asked directly. She looked at him evenly. "Cassian mentions things when they're relevant to me." "Right." He picked up a water glass from the counter, her water glass, and set it down again. "Just making sure everyone's on the same page." "Of course," she said. She turned back to the dessert plates. He stood there for another 4 seconds, and she could feel the calculation running, whether to press, whether to leave it, whether the non-reaction he'd gotten was satisfying or suspicious. Then he went back to the dining room. She noted that he had moved her water glass without reason. She noted the specific gesture, deliberate entry into her physical space, physical relocation of her property without permission. And she noted the time, 9:48 p.m. She noted it the way she noted everything, precisely, without drama, in the understanding that precision was the instrument and drama was the distraction. She arranged the dessert plates. The recorder in the living room bookshelf captured the audio of Darnell's re-entry into the dining room, the resumed conversation, and at 11:42 that evening, after the guests had gone and Cassian had poured himself a drink in the study, a phone call Darnell made from his position near the front entry, while he believed Cassian was occupied and Imani had already gone upstairs. She had not gone upstairs. She was in the laundry room off the back hallway, folding the evening's cloth napkins with the door open an inch. The call lasted 4 minutes. Most of it was clipped and logistical, but near the end, Darnell's voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted to make certain a thing was understood rather than merely communicated. Clean it before Friday, and make sure she's not there when it happens. 6 words, and then the soft click of a call ending. Imani set down the napkins she'd been folding and stood still for a moment in the dark of the laundry room. The word she in that sentence could have referred to several things, but 6 hours earlier, Britta had sent Floyd a message Imani had not seen, but had inferred from a change in Floyd's behavior over dinner. A very slight recalibration in the direction of his attention toward Cassian's end of the table. And she, combined with before Friday and clean it, produced only one coherent reading when she assembled it against everything else she had documented over 11 years. She was not afraid, or more precisely, the thing that moved through her was not fear, because fear is primarily concerned with the present, and she was primarily concerned with what came next. She was behind schedule by 9 days. She had known this for 2 weeks. She had been managing it, revising her timeline incrementally, accepting small delays as the cost of precision. But Darnell's call was not a small delay. It was a compressed deadline delivered without her name in it, which was, she understood, the point. She went upstairs. She did not go to bed. The following Monday, Wells Crane came to find her. Wells was one of Cassian's operational people, not a principal, not a confidant, but the kind of man who occupied the useful middle layer of any organization, present at enough meetings to know the outlines of what was happening without being central enough to know the specifics. He'd been with the organization for 5 years, and Imani had cataloged him early as a man whose primary professional motivation was self-preservation. He was not ideologically committed to Cassian's operation. He was economically committed to it, which was a different and in some circumstances more exploitable thing. But before Wells, there was the envelope. On Sunday morning, the day before Wells found her at the market, a courier arrived at the house with a document requiring her signature. This was not unusual. Cassian used couriers regularly for business correspondence. What was unusual was that the courier asked for Imani by name, not Cassian, and the envelope carried the name of a family law firm on Peachtree Road that she had seen referenced once in a billing statement she had not been meant to see. She signed for it. She closed the door. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Inside was a 15-page document titled Supplemental Marital Asset Agreement, Addendum to Original Marriage Contract. The cover page identified it as an agreement between Cassian Rhee and Imani Voss, prepared by Britta Calloway's firm on behalf of the Rhee family interests. She read it in full without stopping, sitting at the kitchen table with the morning light coming in flat and gray from the east window. It ran to 15 pages, but its operative effect compressed to approximately 3. If she signed it, she would acknowledge that all physical materials, communications, financial records, and stored data relevant to Cassian's business interests, including any such materials stored in the marital home, were the exclusive property of those business interests and not subject to third-party disclosure without written consent from the organization's legal representative. The legal representative identified in the document was Britta Calloway. There was a signature line at the bottom of page 15 with Imani's printed name beneath it. There was also, in the document's lower footer, a notation that read, "Consideration, continued participation in marital asset arrangement per current terms," which was, stripped of its dressing, the document's candid acknowledgement of what it was offering her in exchange for signing. Nothing new. The existing arrangement continued. The implicit threat was in what was not offered. What would happen to the existing arrangement if she did not sign? She sat with the document for several minutes. She turned to page 11 and reread the clause defining stored data, because it was the broadest clause in the document and its breadth was informative. Then she took out her phone and opened the notes application and typed a citation from memory. OCGA, Section 19-3-63, Georgia's statute on antenuptial agreements, which Georgia courts extend by analogy to postnuptial instruments of this type. The enforceability standards were consistent across both categories. Each party must have independent legal counsel, adequate time for review, and separate consideration, not simply a continuation of existing arrangements, for the agreement to survive challenge. The document failed every one of those requirements. It had been sent without notice. It designated Britta, Cassian's own attorney, as the sole legal representative, with no provision for independent counsel. And its consideration was circular. Sign this and we will continue to treat you as we currently do. This was not consideration under Georgia law. It was a dressed-up threat with a signature line. She set the document face down on the table. She photographed each of the 15 pages with her personal phone, in order, with the kitchen table and the morning light visible in each frame as context. She photographed the envelope, including the courier label with its timestamp. She photographed the firm's letterhead. Then she placed all 15 pages back in the envelope, sealed it with a strip of clear tape she applied carefully to preserve the original closure beneath it, and wrote 3 words across the tape in her own hand. Received, not signed. She dated and initialed the notation. She put the envelope in the guest room closet in the fireproof case. That afternoon, she called an attorney, not from her regular phone, from the prepaid one, dialing a number she had maintained in her own memory for 8 months against the possibility of exactly this kind of moment. The attorney was a woman in Decatur who specialized in family law and had no connection to anyone in Cassian's professional orbit. The call lasted 22 minutes. Imani described the document in precise detail and asked 3 specific questions. The attorney answered all 3 and confirmed what Imani had already concluded. "It's not enforceable," the attorney said, "but that's not why they sent it." "No," Imani agreed, "it's not." She thanked the attorney. She ended the call. She removed the battery from the prepaid phone. The document's purpose had not been enforcement. It had been measurement, a calibrated test to see whether Imani would sign something she should not sign, which would have told them she was either ignorant or compliant, or whether she would refuse in a way that told them something considerably more useful about what she understood. She had refused in a way that told them nothing at all. She had not returned the document. She had not called Cassian. She had not contacted Britta's firm. She had simply received the document, confirmed its contents, and placed it in her evidence file. The absence of a response was itself a kind of response, but it was the kind that gave them nothing to build on. They would know she had received it. They would not know what she had done with it or how she had read it. They would be left with ambiguity, which was exactly where she needed them to remain for the next 4 days. On Monday morning, the situation with Darnell escalated in the way that direct men escalate when the indirect approaches have produced insufficient results. He was waiting in the attached garage when she came down at 7:45 to get her car. Not conspicuously positioned, not blocking the car door, not standing in her direct path. Standing near the workbench along the far wall, with his phone in his hand, in the posture of a man who had arrived there by coincidence and remained by choice. She opened the car door and began loading her bag into the passenger seat. "Hold up a minute," he said. She did not hold up. She finished placing the bag, straightened, and looked at him across the roof of the car. "Cassian needs you to sit tight this week," Darnell said. "Don't be going out more than necessary." His tone was conversational. The instruction was not. She recognized the specific register, the order delivered as practical advice, the restriction framed as consideration, because it was a technique designed to bypass the moment of consent. If she accepted it as practical advice, she'd accepted the restriction without him having to admit it was one. "Is there something I should know about?" she asked. "Just some logistics being worked out," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Nothing for you to worry about. The sentence was a wall with a pleasant face painted on it. On the other side of it was, "Stay where we can see you. Don't move before we're ready." She looked at him for a moment without expression. Then she said his name, just his name, clearly at a volume and tone that were entirely unremarkable. And then she said the time. "Darnell, 7:47 a.m., Monday." He frowned. "What?" She said nothing further. She got in the car. She said his name and the time because the recorder she had placed in the garage 4 days ago, a second unit, purchased on the same cash trip that had produced the padlock and the motion sensor, was running on a shelf behind the garden supplies, and she wanted the encounter to have clear timestamps and identifiable voices from the moment of its first operative sentence. Saying his name was not for him, it was for the record. She backed out of the garage and drove to the farmer's market. Georgia Code Section 16-11-62, one-party consent. She had been over this citation so many times that it had lost its character as a legal reference and become simply a fact about the world, the way the rules of arithmetic are facts, present, reliable, requiring no further verification. He found her at the farmer's market on Tuesday morning. She went every Tuesday, a routine she had maintained deliberately and without variation for 8 years, because routine is the cover that makes deviation invisible. He appeared at the produce stall beside her with the particular casualness of someone who had engineered his arrival and wanted it to read as accidental. "Good morning," he said. She looked at him and waited. He selected a bunch of radishes and turned them in his hands without buying them. "I've been thinking," he said, keeping his voice at the ambient level of the market around them, "that there are some people in the current arrangement who are going to end up on the wrong side of certain things." She said nothing. "I just want to make sure that the right people, people who have maybe been keeping track of things, people who have maybe been more careful than others about what they know, that those people end up in a position to make choices." He set down the radishes. "If there are things being collected, it might be good to have a conversation about what a fair exchange looks like." He looked at her then, directly, for the first time in their years of proximity. Not the categorizing look that Darnell used, but something sharper and more provisional. The look of a man who has put a chip on a number and is waiting to see where the wheel stops. She looked back at him for a long moment without any expression that gave him what he was looking for. Then she said, "Thank you, Wells. That's useful." He waited visibly for the rest of the sentence. It didn't come. "I appreciate you telling me," she said, and moved to the next stall. He stood by the radishes for a moment longer, and she didn't watch him to see what he did next, because she didn't need to. She already knew what his approach meant. Wells Crane had approached her because he'd picked up enough peripheral information to believe she was holding something valuable. And he'd constructed a protection offer because he thought it might buy him a share of it. He didn't know what she had. He didn't know who she was. He only knew she was someone worth approaching, which meant the perimeter around the operation was beginning to notice that something had changed. She bought her vegetables and walked to her car and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Wells Crane had just done two things for her simultaneously. He had confirmed that the organization's internal awareness of a problem was now high enough that people were making lateral moves to protect themselves. And he had given her, in a single direct statement, if there are things being collected, an admissible acknowledgement that collection was a known possibility. She noted the time, 10:44 a.m., Tuesday. She noted his exact words. She noted the weather, the location, the fact that she had been the only party present who knew the conversation was happening in a place where ambient audio carried. She drove home and went to the guest room closet. The device came out of its case. She updated the encrypted partition. She added the Wells Crane interaction to a subsection she had labeled, in her own notation system, as convergence indicators. She noted that the indicator count had now reached the threshold she had set herself 18 months ago. She put the device back. She went to make lunch. That evening, she called her contact on a number she had memorized rather than saved, from a phone that was not registered to her name and was purchased with cash from a store 40 minutes from the house. The call lasted 11 minutes. She spoke in a low, level voice, and what she described, in the clipped, reference-based language of someone reporting to someone who already had context, was a compressed timeline, a location confirmation, and a specific category of evidence now sufficient to meet the threshold they had established. The person on the other end of the call said, "We'll confirm receipt." She said, "Understood." She ended the call. She removed the battery from the phone. She placed both in her bag. On her drive back to the house 20 minutes later, she stopped at a hardware store on Peachtree Industrial. She purchased a small motion sensor device, ordinary retail, the kind sold for monitoring doorways and package deliveries. She paid cash. She also purchased a combination padlock with a 4-digit code. 2 items, neither of them unusual in isolation. Together they completed the last material element of what she had been building for 11 years. Cassian left for his overnight trip on Wednesday evening. He kissed her on the cheek at the door. He told her he'd be back Thursday. He said he might be late. The Nashville contact was taking them to dinner. His tone was the tone of a man narrating a fact rather than a conversation, and she heard the specific flatness in it that she had learned, over years, to read as the flatness of someone who has already decided what his evening is going to include and has rationalized his way to equanimity about it. She held his coat while he put it on. She said to drive carefully. She stood at the door as his car pulled out and watched the taillights until they rounded the corner. And then she went back inside. She cooked dinner for one. She ate it at the kitchen table, slowly, without distraction. She washed the dishes by hand rather than using the machine, which was not her usual habit, but which gave her something to do with her hands while she thought through the sequence. At 9 p.m., she went to the guest room. She removed the device from the case behind the baseboard. She removed the small leather notebook from the drawer beneath her bedside table. She removed a sealed envelope from the space behind the loose ceiling tile in the closet, a space she had identified in the 3rd month of the marriage when she'd been measuring a shelf and discovered the gap. She sat on the guest room bed with these 3 things in front of her and went through them in sequence, methodically, the way she had been trained to go through operational documentation before a phase transition. Not reading, she knew the contents of all 3. Confirming, verifying the structure, making certain that what she intended to leave in the house was complete, authenticated, and positioned where it would be found in the correct order. At 10:47 p.m., she sent 2 files to a secure server via the encrypted connection. She received an automated acknowledgement at 10:49. At 11:15, she placed the sealed envelope, the one that had been prepared over the course of 3 weeks, revised twice, and sealed with a tamper-evident closure, on the kitchen table, slightly to the left of center, in a position that would be visible from the hallway, but not from the front entry. Close enough to the surface to be clearly intentional. far enough from the edge to indicate it had been placed there with care rather than urgency. She wrote one word on the front of the envelope in her own hand, Cassian's name, nothing else. She placed a second envelope, smaller, padded, at the back of the bedroom closet shelf, behind a stack of winter sweaters. This one bore no name. It bore a document number in the upper right corner, handwritten, 12 digits, the formatting of a federal case reference. She locked the bedroom door. From the outside, using a key she had cut from the original 14 months after they married, when Cassian had suggested, and then forgotten, that they should have a spare. She reset the deadbolt so that the lock engaged with a double click. Then she stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to the house. 3:41 a.m. was outside the window. She had approximately 6 hours before Cassian arrived home. She had planned for 4. The buffer was not incidental. She walked to the front entry. She picked up her keys from the tray, her reading glasses, her transit card, the brass keyring with its particular weight in her hand. She opened the front door. She stepped outside into the March night, which was cold and clear and entirely indifferent to what she was doing, and pulled the door shut behind her with the careful, deliberate click of someone who has spent 11 years learning exactly how much force a door requires to close without waking anyone. She walked to her car without looking back. The house sat behind her in the dark, holding everything she had left inside it. The envelope on the kitchen table, the padded package behind the winter sweaters, the recorder in the living room bookshelf with its 93 hours of logged audio, still running, its small green indicator light blinking at its usual patient interval. And somewhere on the home network server, in a folder labeled Household Admin that Floyd Yesh had reviewed twice without finding anything of note, a file that had been in place since the 11th month of the marriage, a file whose contents would not be legible to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking at, but which would be entirely legible and entirely devastating to the people who did. She started the car. She pulled out of the driveway. 3 blocks away, she stopped at a traffic light. She took out her phone, the regular one, the one registered in her name, and sent a single text to a number saved under the label, Insurance. The message was 4 words. It's done. Confirm. Ready. The reply came in 40 seconds. 1 word. Ready. She put the phone in her bag. The light changed. She drove. Behind her, in a house that was still and dark and beginning, in some way it had never been before, to tell the truth about itself, the lock on the bedroom door clicked twice in the settling of the frame. Then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't wait, the kind that has already moved on to what comes next. Cassian found the envelope at 9:43 a.m. He had come home, as expected, slightly later than Thursday. The Nashville dinner had run long. His return pushed to Friday morning. He'd driven through a thin Georgia drizzle, let himself in, set his bag down in the entry, and noticed the tray immediately. The absence on it was not something he registered consciously at first. He moved toward the kitchen on the ordinary trajectory of a man who wanted coffee, and it was only when he cleared the hallway that he saw the envelope on the table. His name, her handwriting, nothing else. He stood with his coat still on and looked at it for a long moment before touching it. Men like Cassian had a developed instinct for the weight of things before opening them. Not a mystical instinct, but the accumulated calibration of someone who had spent decades learning to read the temperature of a room from its surface details. The envelope was sealed precisely. It was centered on the table with a deliberateness that was not accidental. It had been placed there to be found. He opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a single page, handwritten, in the same measured cursive she used for everything. It was not a letter in the emotional sense. It had no salutation, no apology, no declaration. It was a statement of facts, organized in the order they had occurred, referencing dates and account designations. And in the 4th paragraph, a file path on the home network server, followed by a 12-digit reference number. Beneath the reference number, she had written one sentence: "The contents of this file have been received and authenticated by the relevant federal authority as of 10:49 p.m., Thursday, March 14th. The second document was a photocopy of the supplemental marital agreement that Britta's firm had sent by courier the previous Sunday. Across the top, in Imani's hand, "Received, not signed," dated, initialed, and beneath the copy a two-line notation identifying the document as potential evidence of attempted coercion in a matter pending before the U.S. Attorney's Office, Northern District of Georgia. Cassian read both documents twice. He sat down at the kitchen table, slowly, the way a person sits when their legs have made the decision before their brain has finished processing. And he read them a third time. Then he called Britta. She answered on the second ring, already dressed, already mobile, which told him she had been expecting the call, or something like it, which in turn told him how long she had known that the situation was further along than she had represented to him. The conversation lasted 6 minutes, and by the end of it, Cassian understood three things he had not understood before 9:43 a.m. That the L7 accounts had been under federal scrutiny for considerably longer than Floyd had indicated. That the supplemental agreement Britta had sent without consulting him had been her own initiative, not his. And that the woman he had lived beside for 11 years had not, in any moment of those 11 years, been who he believed her to be. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after ending the call. The drizzle outside had become proper rain. It moved against the windows in sheets, and the sound of it in the quiet house had a quality that Cassian, if he had been given to that kind of reflection, might have recognized as appropriate. He was still sitting there when Darnell arrived at 11:15. Darnell had a key. He let himself in the way he always did, moving through the house with the proprietary confidence of a man who had long since stopped distinguishing between his employer's space and his own. He found Cassian at the table with two documents in front of him and a coffee cup that had been full an hour ago and was now cold and untouched. He read the documents without being invited to. When he finished, he said, "She won't get far." It was the wrong thing to say. Cassian looked at him with an expression that Darnell, for the first time in 6 years of working for this man, could not fully interpret. It was not anger. It was not the cold calculation that preceded one of Cassian's operational decisions. It was something quieter and, in its quietness, considerably more concerning. "She already has," Cassian said. He was correct. By 11:15 on a Friday morning in March, Imani Voss, whose legal name was Imani Voss Carver, though the second half of that name had not appeared on any document in the marital home, had been in a conference room on the 14th floor of a federal building on Spring Street for 4 hours and 20 minutes. She was not alone in the conference room. Across the table from her sat an assistant U.S. attorney named Marcus Lee, a forensic accountant from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and a woman named Claudette Marsh, who held the title of Deputy District Attorney for Fulton County, and who had until approximately 6 months ago been skeptical of everything about this case. Claudette had been skeptical for good reason. The case had been constructed almost entirely by a single source whose position, the wife of the primary target, operating inside the household for 11 years, was, from an evidentiary standpoint, complicated. Defense attorneys would call it compromised. They would argue bias, contamination, the inherent unreliability of evidence gathered in secret by a party with a direct personal stake in the outcome. They would argue these things loudly and at length, and some of those arguments would not be entirely wrong. Claudette had said all of this to Marcus Lee in September, when the file had first crossed her desk. She had said it again in November. She had said a version of it as recently as January, sitting in this same conference room, looking at a file that was impressive in its scope and troubling in its collection methodology. What had changed her position, incrementally and then decisively, was the quality of the documentation itself. Imani spread the materials on the conference room table in the order they had been organized. 11 years of logs, photographs, authenticated recordings, and financial cross-references, each element tagged with its collection date, its collection method, and its applicable legal authority. The logs were not notes. They were contemporaneous records, time-stamped and initialed in a format that was, Marcus Lee had observed to a colleague after their first meeting, more rigorous than the documentation produced by most law enforcement agencies on active investigations. The recordings were authenticated through the chain of custody she had maintained. The retail receipts for the recording devices, purchased with cash but photographed and logged on the date of purchase. The unbroken sequence of audio files with continuous timestamps. The specific Georgia Code, Section 16-11-62, notation attached to each file, confirming one-party consent compliance. The financial cross-references drew from documents she had photographed inside the marital home, documents she had legal access to as a resident of the home, and correlated them against publicly available FOIA returns, tax filings, and the Georgia Secretary of State's corporate registration records. Nothing in the file had been obtained through a method that violated the Fourth Amendment. Nothing had been collected through deception or coercion. She had not hacked, she had not trespassed, she had not solicited stolen materials. She had been, for 11 years, in a position that gave her legal access to certain documents and conversations, and she had documented what she observed with a precision that left the material admissible. Claudette had spent 3 weeks in January going through the file looking for the crack she was certain existed. She had not found it. "I want to talk about the L7 accounts," Marcus Lee said on that Friday morning, opening the relevant section of the binder, specifically the third-quarter transfer discrepancy. Imani turned to page 47 of her own copy without looking at the tab. $731,200. The operating ledger, which I photographed on February 3rd, shows a net transfer to the L7 account of approximately $2.4 million for Q3. The document Floyd Yesh delivered to the house in January, which Cassian gave me to file, shows a reported figure of $1.67 million for the same period. And the source document is photographed on February 3rd, timestamp embedded in the image metadata, original document path on the home network server visible in the frame. She referenced the page number. The IT vendor's access logs, which Floyd obtained in February as part of his own review, confirmed that the home network accessed the server at 7:42 a.m. on February 3rd. That access was mine. The login was mine. It was a document Cassian had authorized me to retrieve insurance materials from the same folder. Marcus made a note. He had made a great many notes over the course of 6 months. What he had gradually come to understand about Imani Voss Carver was that her precision was not performance. It was not the precision of someone trying to appear credible. It was the precision of someone who had been trained in the documentation of evidence and who had applied that training without abbreviation to an 11-year project. The file in front of him was the output of a person who had known from the beginning that the file's admissibility would one day be tested and who had built it accordingly. The crane interaction, Claudette said. She had been quiet for the first 30 minutes of the session, reviewing her own copy of the file. At the farmer's market, tell me about the ambient audio. The market on Tuesday mornings occupies approximately half a city block on North Highland. I positioned myself at the second produce stall from the north entry. The ambient sound level is consistent. Vendor activity, foot traffic, no machinery. Wells Crane approached from the south. His voice was fully audible on my phone's standard recording application, which I activated when I identified his approach. She paused. I want to be precise about that. I identified him before I activated the recording. The first 3 seconds of the file capture his approach from approximately 15 feet. His opening line, "Good morning," is on the recording, and his statement, "If there are things being collected," Timestamp 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I can provide the full transcript with my notation of his tone and physical positioning at each statement, which I wrote within 2 hours of the interaction. Claudette set down her pen. She looked at Imani for a moment with an expression that was not warm and was not hostile, and was, after a beat, the expression of a woman who had made a decision she was no longer going to revisit. "The city councilman," she said, "Hardin Wheeler. You have him at the dinner party on the 14th. Seated adjacent to Floyd Yesh." Their conversational interaction at moments of financial topic emphasis, I counted 7 instances over a 4-course dinner, is documented in the log entry for that evening. His name appears in a campaign finance disclosure filed with the Georgia Ethics Commission in October of the previous year, referencing a contribution from a shell entity whose upstream parent company is registered at the same registered agent address as 2 of the L7 account holding companies. She referenced the page. She had always referenced the page. Claudette picked up her pen again. "I want to take a recess," she said to Marcus Lee, "and then I want to go through the Wheeler connection in detail." Marcus nodded. He looked at Imani. "Is there anything you need?" She said she would like water. He brought it. While Claudette and Marcus conferred in the hallway, Imani sat alone in the conference room with the binders arranged in front of her and the rain moving against the 14th floor windows in the same steady sheets it had been moving against Cassian's kitchen windows at the same hour, 40 minutes across the city. She did not think about Cassian. She had made her arrangements for that particular category of thought a long time ago. Not suppression, which was a finite resource, but organization. Cassian occupied a compartment. The compartment was sealed. She would open it when there was a reason to open it, and a conference room in a federal building was not that reason. She thought instead about the 14 pages she had not yet presented. They were in the padded envelope, the one she had placed behind the winter sweaters, which she had retrieved before leaving the house on Thursday night, and which had been in her bag throughout the drive to the hotel, throughout the night, throughout the morning commute to the federal building. 14 pages representing a category of documentation she had held back from the primary file, not because it was weaker, but because it was the strongest single element, and she had learned over 11 years that you do not open with your strongest element, you build to it. She had been building to it for 6 months. Claudette came back first. She sat down across the table without Marcus and looked at Imani directly. "I'm going to be candid with you," she said. "The Wheeler connection is the piece that makes this bigger than a money laundering prosecution. If those campaign finance linkages connect to municipal contracts the way you're implying they do, this touches City Hall. That changes the political temperature of this significantly." "I'm aware," Imani said. "It also makes it more likely that certain parties will attempt to challenge the source of the materials. Your position as the subject's spouse has been anticipated," Imani said. She reached into her bag. She placed the padded envelope on the table. Claudette looked at it. "This is the element I held from the primary file," Imani said. "It addresses the source question directly." She slid the envelope across the table. "The document reference number is on the upper right. The chain of custody begins in the 11th month of the marriage and runs continuously to last night." Claudette opened the envelope. Inside were 14 pages. The first was a cover sheet with a document number, an issuing authority, and a date 11 years prior. The second was a personnel record, not hers technically, but the record of an identity that had been built around hers, layer by layer, over the 18 months preceding the marriage. The third through eighth were operational logs in a format that was not a civilian format, compressed, reference-coded, organized around a timeline that began approximately 14 months before she had met Cassian Rhee at an industry event in Buckhead. Claudette read the first 3 pages. She stopped. She looked up. Imani met her eyes. "The assignment authorization is on page 9, Imani said. "The chain of command is on page 11. Page 14 is the confirmation of identity, countersigned by the relevant supervising authority, dated and sealed. The room was very quiet for a moment. The rain had eased to a drizzle again, the way Georgia rain does in March, arriving in conviction and departing without announcement. Claudette set down the pages. She had the expression of a woman recalculating a very long column of numbers after discovering that the first figure had been wrong. "How long?" she said and stopped. "The assignment was initiated 14 months before the marriage," Imani said. "I have been operational for 12 years and 9 months in total. The documentation of the L7 accounts, the Crane interactions, the Wheeler connection, all of it was collected in my operational capacity, which means it carries a different evidentiary standard than material collected by a private citizen. The admissibility question you were concerned about has a different answer than the one you were working from." Claudette put the pages down carefully, with the particular deliberateness of someone managing their own reaction. She was a woman who had spent 23 years in prosecution and who had, in that time, been surprised by evidence approximately 4 times. This was the 5th. "Marcus needs to see this," she said. "I know," Imani said. Marcus came back. He read the 14 pages. He too stopped at the 3rd page. He too looked up. He did not ask how long. He asked in a voice that was entirely professional and gave nothing away, whether she had been in contact with her supervising authority in the past 48 hours. She had. She referenced the call log from the prepaid phone, which she had reconstructed in writing and included as an attachment on page 13. The session continued for another 4 hours and 17 minutes. They went through the Wheeler connection, the 3rd quarter discrepancy, the Darnell Rook garage recordings, timestamp 7:47 a.m., Monday, March 11th, ambient conditions noted, voice identification possible from existing reference samples, and the Britta Calloway supplemental agreement, which Marcus flagged for separate referral to the State Bar of Georgia's Office of General Counsel, citing a potential violation of Georgia Rule of Professional Conduct 1.7, which governed conflicts of interest. The referral would be preliminary. The disciplinary process, he noted, would take 6 to 18 months. Britta would continue practicing in the interim. This was how the system worked. The formal proceedings that followed unfolded across the next several weeks with the grinding, unsentimental pace of institutional process. 3 days after the conference room session, a federal magistrate issued an order freezing the assets of 7 entities connected to the L7 account structure, pending investigation under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956, the federal money laundering statute. The order was an emergency measure and did not constitute a finding of guilt. Cassian's attorneys filed a motion to lift the freeze within 48 hours. The motion was denied pending further review. Darnell Rook was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 18 days after Imani had left the house. The arresting charge was not connected to the L7 accounts. It was the garage recording, specifically the Monday morning interaction, which Marcus's team had analyzed in conjunction with the Saturday night phone call captured by the living room recorder. Taken together, the 2 recordings supported a charge under Georgia Code Section 16-11-37, criminal intimidation, and a separate charge related to his role in coordinating the "clean it" instruction, which the prosecution framed carefully with the knowledge that the framing would be challenged as evidence of conspiracy to obstruct an ongoing federal investigation. Darnell retained counsel within the hour. His counsel filed for bond. Bond was granted at a figure that suggested the magistrate had read the recordings. Floyd Yesh contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office through his own attorney 9 days after the freeze order, initiating a proffer session. He was not offering to plead guilty. He was offering to cooperate in exchange for consideration, the standard opening position of a person who understands that the evidence against them is substantial and that the value of cooperation diminishes with time. Marcus Lee received the proffer request with the neutrality of a man who had been expecting it. He scheduled the session for 3 weeks out, which was his way of communicating that Floyd's information, while potentially useful, was not so urgently needed that the office would make favorable terms to obtain it quickly. Floyd spent those 3 weeks in the particular purgatory of a man who knows he is going to have to give up more than he wanted to in order to get less than he hoped for. Wells Crane was placed on administrative leave by the organization, an organization that was, by this point, actively contracting around Cassian's involvement, the way a living thing contracts around an injury, redistributing function away from the damaged area. Wells did not contest the leave. He had, in the weeks since his approach to Imani at the farmer's market, developed the quiet, careful demeanor of a man who is counting his exposure and not liking the total. No criminal charges had been filed against him. That could change. Cassian himself received a target letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier to his attorney's office on Piedmont Road. A target letter is not an indictment. It is a formal notification that the recipient is the subject of a federal grand jury investigation and has the right to appear and testify before the grand jury with counsel present. It is also, functionally, the government's way of saying, "We have enough. The next step depends on you." His attorneys read the letter and told him to say nothing to anyone. He did not call Britta after that conversation. He did not call Floyd. He sat in his study that evening with a glass of scotch he didn't finish, and the particular company of a man who was finally, at the cost of everything he built, in full possession of the truth about what he had been living beside. Councilman Hardin Wheeler submitted his resignation from City Council on a Wednesday morning, citing personal reasons. The resignation was accepted without public comment. The campaign finance referral to the Georgia Ethics Commission was not public at that stage. It was under preliminary review, which in the Ethics Commission's timeline meant something between 3 months and never, depending on the political weather. Simone Adair, who had been reporting on municipal finance for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 9 years, and who had received Imani's third contact 6 weeks before the freeze order, published a piece the following Monday that connected Wheeler's resignation to the federal freeze order through public records, the corporate registration addresses, the FOIA-obtained tax filings, the Secretary of State's records. The piece named no confidential sources. It needed none. The public record, assembled with patience, said enough. Claudette Marsh issued a preliminary finding statement through the district attorney's office 11 days after the freeze order. It ran to 4 paragraphs in the careful language of a prosecutor who knows that everything she commits to paper in a public statement will be read by defense attorneys looking for commitments to use against her later. It noted that the investigation was ongoing, that charges were pending grand jury review, and that 2 individuals had been arrested in connection with related criminal conduct. It described the financial scale of the alleged scheme as significant and extending across multiple jurisdictions. It said nothing about the source of the evidence. It said nothing about Imani. The State Bar referral on Britta Calloway was confirmed as received by the Office of General Counsel 14 days after Marcus Lee filed it. Britta retained separate counsel for the bar matter within 48 hours. A different firm, not her own, because representing yourself in a professional conduct proceeding is a specific kind of inadvisable. She continued practicing. The disciplinary process had its own calendar and its own pace, and no one who understood it expected a resolution in the near term. This was what partial looked like. Not all of them stopped, not all of them punished, not the system transformed by morning. 2 arrested, 1 under investigation, 1 on leave, 1 resigned, 1 the subject of a bar referral that would take a year to resolve. The freeze order in place. The grand jury convened. The federal monitor appointed at the U.S. Attorney's recommendation, reviewing the municipal contract records that Simone Adair's piece had flagged. The wheels turning at the pace of institutional machinery, not satisfying, not cinematic, but real. and in their reality, more durable than anything that moves faster. Imani was relocated to a temporary address in Decatur, which was not her permanent address, but was sufficient for the interim. She had a case coordinator now, a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office who handled her communications with the investigative team and ensured that her availability for the grand jury proceedings was managed without exposing her location. She was not in protective custody. She did not need to be, or rather, the need for it was assessed as low given the current position of the principals and the fact that the material she had transmitted was already received and authenticated and beyond the reach of anyone who might have been motivated to interfere with it. She had a routine in Decatur: coffee at 7, a walk through the neighborhood, different routes, the habit of variation, between 7:30 and 8:15. Work at the table by the east window until noon. The case coordinator called most afternoons. In the evenings, she sometimes sat with her original notebook, the small leather one, not the log, and read through its early entries. Not for the information, which she already had, for the texture of the thing. The record of 11 years written in a hand that was smaller in the early pages and didn't change, which meant she had not grown harder, which meant she had decided some time ago that she had done this correctly. 3 weeks after the freeze order, Simone Adair received an email through her encrypted press contact address. The sender was anonymous. The subject line read, "Before Imani." The attachment was a single PDF, 42 pages, with a header that Simone spent 2 days attempting to authenticate through independent channels before concluding that it was real and that it described a set of transactions predating the L7 accounts by 4 years. Transactions that involved 2 names she did not recognize, and 1 name she recognized immediately because it appeared in the Secretary of State's records as a registered agent for 3 of the same holding companies she had already written about. She called her editor. She started making calls. The PDF sat in a folder on her encrypted drive with a label she had given it provisionally, pending further reporting. KF, prior structure. The 2 letters at the beginning matched nothing in the materials she had from Imani. They matched nothing in the public record she had assembled. They were 2 letters and a domain suffix and a set of transactions that suggested the network she had been covering was older and broader than anyone had yet established. She did not publish the PDF. Not yet. You don't publish something you haven't verified, even when it sits in your folder every morning asking to be opened. In the guest room closet of the Decatur address, behind 3 weeks' worth of orderly habitation, the fireproof case sat with its device and its 11 years of encrypted history. Imani had not opened it since the night she'd transmitted the files. There was no operational reason to open it. The transmission was complete. The file was received. The case coordinator had confirmed authentication. But there was one thing in the case that had not been transmitted. One element she had held back from the 14 pages, from the primary file, from every binder on the conference room table. Not because it was weak, because its strength depended on the moment of its use, and that moment had not yet arrived. It was a single document, 4 pages, with a date 6 months before she had first met Cassian Rhee. It bore a case number that predated the one on the 14 pages by several years, and it named, in its second paragraph, an individual whose name had not appeared anywhere in the investigation to date. Not in the L7 documents, not in the Wheeler campaign finance records, not in the Simone Adair pieces, not in the prosecutor's preliminary findings. The name was not KF, but it was. Imani had known for 2 years, connected to whoever KF was, connected in a way that, once the connection was established, would change the shape of everything that had been established before it. She left the case closed. She went to make coffee. Outside, Atlanta moved through its ordinary morning. The commute on the connector, the school drop-offs on the residential streets, the city doing the unremarkable business of existing without knowing that somewhere in its institutional machinery, a set of wheels had begun to turn that would not stop for a long time, and would not stop cleanly, but would stop with enough force to change the shape of certain things permanently. That was the most she had ever asked of a process. Not transformation, not complete accounting, not the satisfying conclusion that the scale of the wrongdoing seemed to demand. Just enough force, applied with enough precision, to make the structure untenable in its current form. It was enough. It had to be. Her coffee finished brewing. She poured it. On the 14th floor of the federal building on Spring Street, a grand jury was in the early stages of its work. In the district attorney's preliminary findings folder, a case number sat beside the words, "Ongoing investigation." In the State Bar's Office of General Counsel, a referral moved through its queue with the patience of a system that has no incentive to move faster. In a folder on Simone Adair's encrypted drive, 42 pages waited for the reporting that would make them publishable. And in the home on the far side of Atlanta, the house with the empty tray by the door, and the bedroom deadbolt still set, and the recorder in the living room that had finally, after 93 hours, reached the end of its tape. Cassian Rhee sat with his attorneys at the dining room table where Imani had served dinner to 11 people she had been cataloging for years. And he answered the questions he had been told he had to answer, and declined the ones he had been told he could decline, and said nothing about what had been left on the kitchen table, because there was nothing useful left to say about it. The morning light came through the east window the same way it had always come. Nothing about the light had changed. Everything beneath it had. 11 years. No badge visible. No dramatic confrontation in a hallway. No speech delivered to a crowded room. Just a woman who understood, from the very beginning, that the most powerful thing she could carry into that house was patience and the discipline to use it correctly. Imani Voss didn't win because she was louder. She won because she was precise. While the people around her mistook her silence for compliance, she was building something they had no framework to recognize, a case constructed brick by brick, date by date, citation by citation, until the structure was so solid that not even the most expensive defense attorney in Atlanta could find the crack. The lesson here isn't about revenge, it's about this. The people who underestimate you are handing you an advantage every single time they look through you. The question is whether you're paying attention enough to use it. Real power doesn't announce itself. It documents. It waits. It moves when the moment is right, not when the anger is loudest. And when it moves, the door doesn't slam. It simply clicks shut. Quietly. Finally. If this story stayed with you, hit like and subscribe. There are more stories like Imani's waiting, and you won't want to miss a single one.